issue with the stability of Russia. $50 a barrel oil. We're seeing unemployment in places like Tomsk, people not getting paid, banks failing in the Prem. The concern I have is that you can take maybe a year or two more of this without some real social upset. And Putin's problem is he promised to make Russia a great power and to pay everybody. Of the two promises, paying everybody is the bigger one. If they can't pay, what do you think happens? Can you hold on?
I think that the cheap money coming from oil were very unusual for Russia, I would put it this way. From 2004 to 2014, 10 years, plentiful years, I would put it this way.
Extraordinary years.
Extraordinary years, and probably they would never come back.
But you built your budget around.
That was like for 10 years. I don't think that it have an imprint or a birthmark of Russian economy. It is much more diversified than you can expect, first. Second, truly, a lot of those money were spent on the social stability measures, and you couldn't do another thing with those money, bearing in mind the legacy of the 90s. You should have shown something to the public that the government is working.
You should have diversified the economy too.
And they did what was, I don't think that that was like 100% what they could have done, but I think that they have trying to do many things. And currently, well, the number of sums which are coming from oil to the Russian budget is constantly decreasing. It is currently 44%. It has been 80%. So,
but what was the price? By reducing it that much, what aren't you able to do?
80% was in relatively, small oil prices. When Soviet Union collapsed, basically all the economy collapsed because the planning.
So you're going back to there.
The planning economy was there, and currently what we're witnessing, it's not that economy is not diversified. It's simultaneously being replaced. The planning economy is trying to be replaced by the capitalist economy, and Russia as an economic body was not imagined as a capitalist free market. Resources in one part of the country in Siberia, industrial base in another part of the country, to deliver gas and oil there. It actually, the amount of space those resources pass is a territory of Europe completely. Huge amount of space. And I think that if the trend that we're witnessing is a permanent one, that the price would stabilize between 20 and 50, it's relatively fine. They will manage it. I don't expect this to be a catastrophic for Russia. It's not a petrostate in the way that it was described. Russia has its own nuclear power plant program. It has its own space program. It has its own, IT specialists. Its segment of internet is very much developed. It's agricultural, very fertile territory. It's not that fragile as you can say, looking at the structural Russian budget.
Well, when we look at the Prem, when we look to the smaller towns, there are minor reports of a demonstration here, a bank there. So it's nothing that we would look at and say, okay, they're falling apart. But in the context of this situation, I wonder whether or not we're looking at a forerunner of much greater problems. And I don't know the fragility of the Russian economy or of Russian society.
Russia as an entity, as a country, is an experiment, as any country is actually. And Russian experiment in these borders exists for approximately 300 years, since Peter the Great, without North Caucasus and Khabarovsk region. Mm-hmm. So these huge territorial 11-hour belts territory. Very asymmetrically developed, center of gravity in Europe, 75% of population and GDP produced there. Russian budget and Russian economy was all the time securitized. During the Peter the Great, security budget was up to 80%. The ability of a government and of a nation to mobilize resources to compete in a selected specific area is very much developed. Possibly Russia is a champion in this. It can focus resources on the most important issue.
Russia has the ability to solve the most pressing problem. Long-term pressure is something that most countries, including Russia, can't endure. Part of this is an arithmetic problem. We have lost in Russia so much percentage of the federal budget. This in turn translates into what's shortage, how can we make up the shortage? In crisis, Russia reacts very, very well. There are three Russias. There is the Russia that reacts very well to crisis. There's the Russia that will endure poverty for a very long time, much longer than other countries. And there's the Russia that explodes. The interesting story is that when the Soviet Union fell, Russia didn't explode. It was, before that, no explosion. It was the elite taking it apart. So the question is, if we have this sort of problem now, not so much what happens in the countryside, what happens in the elite? We saw the elite make very bad decisions. The Politburo make very bad decisions when the Soviet Union fell. And their decision in Eastern Europe and the timing was equally unfortunate. One of the problems was that they had groupthink. They all thought the same things. They didn't have input from the outside. This is a different elite. This is elite, however, you always wonder what the splits are. And from the outside, it's very hard to tell what the splits are because they've also worked together for a very long time. They've also had the experience of the fall of the Soviet Union, and none of them want to live through that again. They must feel collectively uneasy about the measures they have to take. And they must be competing with each other as to who is going to be held responsible and so on. So if we take the fall of the Soviet Union as a model, there was great endurance in the people. They did not rise. It fell almost as a decision from the elite. Therefore, the question for me is, what kind of decisions is the elite making now? I'm not worried about war. That's not what they're going to decide. But can they hold together sufficiently to manage the situation?
I would completely agree with your observation that it was more of an elite issue than the general implosion of the country. And it strikes me that there are parallels between the collapse of the Soviet Union and the first February Russian Revolution in 1917. The elite issue at that moment was the crucial one. And I recently reread basically Alexander Solzhenitsyn's work on February Revolution in Russia, and he, I think, analytically excellently put it. His idea why the emperor has resigned so easily was because he lost his faith in his cause, and the elite lost a faith in their cause. And this sense of unjustness of their cause and bring them the sense of powerlessness. And I think comparing to this, and that was also had its parallels during the time of Soviet collapse. Communist elite lost its sense of reality and lost its sense that its cause was just. That's why, say, Yeltsin was much more efficient, energetic, empathetic with the public. And the those people who tried to put the military takeover of power in the 1991, they basically lost their faith in their cause. Comparing to this psychological effect, current Russian elite, you see very forceful people who are ready to fight for their cause. They are ready to mobilize people around that cause. And as Ukraine crisis showed, that they are very resilient under pressure, even when they are personally affected by sanctions, when their family affected by sanctions. I think what we call in Russian politics a Crimea consensus, something that unites nation as a whole, is still working. I would be contemplating that Russia is in trouble when this sense of purpose would fade away. But currently, I see that sense of purpose is there.
So the question is, given the crisis, the economic problem, call it whatever you want to call it, how long it happens before the elite starts to be sapped of confidence that they will recover. And of course, all the members don't get it at the same time. Splits in competition and so on. So we Americans are always looking at the Russians, trying to understand the relationships between the various players, as you look at the United States, trying to understand the relationship between the players. When we look at that, we see certain anomalies. When Putin wasn't available for, I think, a week, the possibility that he took a vacation was never considered. So these things happen and we don't know. But you understand that for the United States, and I think most Americans haven't thought of this, the decline of Russia would present a particularly dangerous problem, in the sense that we experienced with the fall of the Soviet Union the nuclear question, and then we had a successor state, and we moved everything to the successor state, and the successor state was competent enough to manage the weapons and control them. So I think one of the things that the Russians believe is that the United States is trying to destabilize Russia. In fact, among serious people, there's an awareness of the next event of that. I think they would be happier to understand Russia behaving in a way we want, or reaching an agreement, than destabilizing Russia. And I, for one, worry about this thing with oil going out of control, because I see no interest in the United States of having Russia collapse. And in the contrary, I see many reasons why we don't want to have this. Now, in Eastern Europe, of course, they would feel differently, some of them. But I think when we all think about it, with the current situation in Ukraine, with détente over the Baltics, which we really have, I would look at the situation as manageable, particularly if Belarus didn't destabilize. If Belarus destabilized, then we would have issues, but all of them could be managed. But I think we have an asymmetry of understanding. The United States is not eager to see the fall of the Russian regime, and in fact worries about the consequences, not because we love the Russians, but because we worry about the consequences. The Americans now feel that you're trying to destabilize the United States, not because you have destabilized the United States, but because they feel you've tried to. Whether you've tried to or not is not of consequence, but is consequence of this feeling. So I've reached the conclusion that our biggest concern is anything destabilizing Russia. And when we look at the various parts of our relationship, the hostility growing in the United States toward Russia over this issue. And the Russians did little bits here and there to jab us, to let us know that it's possible that it did. So they should not always be innocent victims here. We played a dangerous game with each other. Dangerous not in the sense that a couple of emails, nor dangerous in the sense that you hacked our computers because we hacked your computers. Dangerous in the sense that you bought attention, or attention was bought to the US-Russia relationship. And that was the problem with the Ukraine. The Ukraine changed our relationship and created a faction that saw you as far more dangerous than you are, and hostile, therefore. Who caused the events in Ukraine is not important. I'm trying to point out that we are evolving not to a dangerous point, but to an unpleasant point that could become a dangerous point.
I think I would start with Ukraine, and I trust that we, with the United States, have reached a situation of equilibrium in terms of mutual disengagement from one another. I would even put it that we have normalized our relations in a way. This is a new normal of them. It is too unnatural for them to be too good or too bad. And the current state of mutual suspicious, probably even mutual paranoia, is not that bad. It's much worse to have an Americans just disregarding, disrespecting Russians, just do not noticing them on the map. And if for some reasons Americans are now seeing that Russian government probably can do something that you don't want us to do to Russia, that can be like a red line for
You're too young to remember the Cold War. And in the Cold War, when we played these games, the Americans tended to escalate in unexpected ways. Then the Russians escalated, but not against each other. In the Middle East, in Egypt, in China, we made moves. So one of the things, of course, as the Vietnam War wound down, you'd supplied weapons to the Vietnamese, they were defeating us, we reached an agreement with the Chinese, which changed the Eurasian balance of power fundamentally. Russia sometimes during the Cold War took steps that they regarded as fairly minor and not warranting major response. The Americans regarded that as if they will take this step, they will likely take this step, thus it warrants a major thing. So we need to study what happened in the Cold War.
I would agree. I think Cold War bears a lot of strategic experience which still are unexplored by these generations of policymakers. Cuban Missile Crisis, a situation where nobody had a direct communication with one another, but for some reasons managed to avoid a nuclear showdown. And a few others instances where a status quo solution was found out without a lot of people being killed. But since we're living in a different environment in many ways, and the world is much more interconnected, and Russia and the United States are not the only players on the...
They never were. The Chinese were also players.
Yeah.
The Egyptians, the Israelis, I mean...
To a lesser extent that they are now. Say the Russia-Turkish crisis last year, that was, I think, the closest moment when there could have been a major war between two big military powers. Turkey is number 2 in NATO in terms of military capacity. Russia is a nuclear power. And we basically came close to a line when the force could have been used. If you observe what were the scenarios of the military exercises in Russia and Turkey throughout that 7 months, it was very clear that the probable solution to this would be a war.
But when we looked at it, we didn't think that the Turks were in any condition to initiate a conflict. And the Russians still have difficulty with large-scale logistics at a distance. So Syria is not as large as the invasion of Turkey. That's
well, look, war of the 21st century wouldn't look like the war of 20th century. The areas that would be attacked would not be probably even the whole territory of the enemy. Satellites, data centers.
The Air Force told us before World War II that it's no need for any ground troops because now we can just come and bomb the cities and they'll surrender.
Yeah.
So one of the things I've learned about military experts is they love the new technology and they assure you that this war will be much less bloody than the last one.
But look, even at that time, the occupation of the major country was not a feasible thing, and nobody would intend to occupy a country like Russia or Turkey.
In many ways, wars are blocked because the weapons we have available are uncertain in their effect. We still come down to a major question. How do we de-escalate U.S.-Russian tensions? You are suggesting that the United States ignored Russia. I'm suggesting that the United States wound up way overreacting to Russia in Ukraine. So one of the outcomes of the Ukraine is we saw Russia in a very different way, unfortunately different given all the circumstances. We now see each other. It's no longer a question of that. It's a question of destabilization. you can go back to Moscow and think about how to how to de-escalate. I will go back to Austin and try to de-escalate.
I think the first step that we should need for Americans to consider issues of European security seriously. Not to say that, you know, those Balts, Poles and Russians are paranoid and they just have, you know, artificial complaints about the security infrastructure. There is actually this geopolitical frontier there.
There is a very real one, and
yeah,
we have made a signal that we take it very seriously.
absolutely.
And the Russians have made a signal by maneuvering near the borders that they take it very seriously. Okay, now we both know we take it seriously.
And I think that's a proper way to start to feel seriously about each other. And history taught us that that's a first step to de-escalate.
But we remember Georgia. The Russians maintained a exercise, and we can discuss exactly what happened in between. Suddenly we had a war. So let's assume for the moment that you have an exercise and some Bolt comes across, does something, you take it to be a hostile act, and we're there. In Georgia, we were not there really in large numbers. In the Baltics, we are increasing our presence.
You exclude an opportunity of the third actor like Georgia trying to manipulate the United States and drag it in.
Sugar Valley, I'm thoroughly familiar with what happened. But from the American point of view, what happened was not that they manipulated the United States. It is they brought the United States into a situation that the Russian perception of what was going on was not the American intention. You acted. It had no consequence because we had no forces in Georgia. A similar confrontation in the Baltics would probably bring you into contact with some small forces.
How a similar confrontation in Baltic can emerge?
How could Georgia attack a small town and the Russians take this as evidence of hostile intent?
They killed Russian forces.
We understand. Suppose that a
There is
Baltic small unit crosses the border and attacks a Russian unit.
For what reason?
For the same reason the Georgians did.
No, look, in Georgia they had a territorial dispute with these small entities which broke away from them 20 years ago. And at that moment, Georgians believed that by making a political point by military means, they would resolve two things. First, since the Russian force was very small, they can easily took it to the border with Russia, and then eventually bring Americans who would sustain this new status quo. But Russians wouldn't buy it.
I understand. And so the danger was here that a third party trying to pull a foolish maneuver drew the Russians in, and the Americans didn't come. Okay, good. I worry about a situation where the Americans are there, someone does a foolish maneuver to draw the Russians in, and the Russians get drawn in. This is the danger of an armed frontier. It is a good demarcation line. It has to be better controlled than it is certainly on our side. But the problem is that a missed signal or a signal that appears hostile can bring actions that you don't intend.
We actually had a perfect stress test for this situation in Russia-Turkey crisis. I think it was Moscow's miscalculation to believe that Turks share the same strategic culture of restraint that Moscow shares with the United States. So we understand exactly what will be the consequence of actions that you have described. Turks, for some reason, they have developed their own very specific strategic culture.
But remember also there was the shooting of the Turkish plane in Latakia, I think it was.
In Latakia, that was by Syrians, not by Russians.
This is a discussion. If you ask the Turks, they give one answer. If you ask the Americans, we have no idea. But there was all sorts of speculation that this was not a Syrian action, but a Russian action. I say this only in the sense, not that I care about that incident, it would explain why the Turks are eager to take an action.
I think that we can still use this as a precedent, because basically Turks decided to use a military force to make a political point. They didn't want to fight a war with Russia, but that was a possibility, a double-digit in percentage possibility of the outcome. And a Russian reaction to this was moderated for a few hours after the incident. They waited what kind of response they would get from Washington and Brussels, basically, the NATO capital. And the alternatives were, if that's a NATO provocation, and Turks are basically used as a buffer, as a frontier, that's one type of response. If that's a Turks independently acting on their own and doing what they perceive is proper in this situation, that's another situation. And actually, President spokesman Dmitry Peskov, he sent several signals to Turkey that for basically opening the door for them to say that that was a mistake.